all of whom, of course, are gathered here, to the University Lectures in Religion, 1985. The recently issued Catholic Bishop's pastoral letter on the United States economy is what has especially excited our interest in this particular topic and in the speaker whom we've been so fortunate to be able to secure. When back in the early fall, late summer, we in the Department of Religion began to discuss this, I made it a point to talk to Father Brian, Dr. Brian Hare, who I believe is Executive Secretary of the National Conference of Bishops. In any case, the scholar and administrator who's been right at the very heart of everything that has gone on, both in this letter from the bishops and in the earlier one dealing with peace and with nuclear weapons. And Father Hare, after I questioned him closely, came forth with a couple of names, and the first was that of Dr. Peter Steinfels as the one whom we should by all means secure, if we could, to address this tremendously important subject. So we're lucky, and we're pleased. Our speaker, Dr. Peter Steinfels, was born in Chicago, grew up there and in Adrian, Michigan, and in Park Ridge, Illinois, educated in Catholic parochial schools, graduated from Loyola University in Chicago in 1963, where, by the way, among his many, many distinctions, he managed to rank as the first academically in his graduating class. And at that point, 1963, he removed to become essentially a New Yorker, living now and since that time in New York City, where he gained a master's in history at Columbia, then a doctorate in history at Columbia, his dissertation being on French left-wing intellectuals and foreign policy in the 1930s, and entered upon a professional career of editing important and very intellectual journals. An important one out of Hastings, New York, the Hastings Report. I believe, Peter, you and your wife founded that and started it. It's a distinguished journal dealing with bioethical issues. And since this decade began, he has been the editor, executive, or now full editor of Commonwealth, an independent journal of public affairs, religion, literature, and the arts, published by Roman Catholic lay people, founded, I believe, in 1924, and I checked our library, and those of you who might be interested, we have virtually a complete file of that important bi-weekly journal, Commonweal, in our holdings. His publications are entirely too numerous to mention. I counted 21 of the journals in which he has published articles, columns, editorials, reviews, including, besides Commonweal, of course, the New Republic, Harper's, The Nation, New York Times Book Review, and on. Chapters in books, and books among the many, I suppose I should by all means mention certainly the 1979 book, well received, The Neo-Conservatives, of which he is, of course, the author. Dr. Peter Steinfels then comes to us not only well recommended, but obviously extremely well qualified to address this enormously important action on the part of the bishops, Catholic bishops of this country. And will you join me then in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Steinfels, for the University Lectures in Religion.
Thank you very much. Speakers are notorious for announcing one topic and then speaking on another one. I will not do that this evening. I will instead address the very topic proposed, which at least I proposed the title, "The Bishops and the Bottom Line, Can Religion and Economics Mix?" However, the fact that I promised to discuss that question does not guarantee that I'm going to answer it. Of course, in one sense, religion and economics like religion and politics, do mix. But the question that follows is, do they mix poorly, like oil and water, or do they mix well, like, say, scotch and water? To those of you who have been lured here tonight only by the hope of finding a simple yes or no answer to the title's question, I'm afraid that I will have to ruin the suspense and confess that I do not plan to give the definitive yes or no. What I plan to do instead is to examine one effort at mixing religion and politics, one that is very much in the news, and suggest that the difficulties it has met do not perhaps stem from the surface objections that have been raised in public controversies, but rather from much deeper problems. My objective then, one that I learned from my very best teachers, is not so much to enable you to leave here tonight without being confused, but to help you to leave confused at a deeper level. Modern capitalism, John Maynard Keynes wrote, is absolutely irreligious, without internal union, without much public spirit, often, though not always, a mere congeries of possessors and pursuers. Over 60 years ago, R.H. Tawney, who cited those words from the young Keynes, set out to explore how this condition had come about. In his book, with which many of you are no doubt familiar, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, he examined what he called the great intellectual and moral conversion of the 16th and 17th centuries. This, he wrote, saw the abdication of the Christian churches from departments of economic conduct and social theory long claimed as their province. In this secularization of social and economic philosophy, a synthesis of values presided over by religion was, said Tawney, resolved into its elements: politics, business, and spiritual exercises. Each assumes a separate and independent vitality and obeys the laws of its own being, separate and parallel compartments between which a due balance should be maintained, but which have no vital connection with each other. Now, like other politically committed scholars, Tawney saw his historical investigations as intimately linked to contemporary concerns. In this case, it was his belief that, as he said, the philosophy which would keep economic interests and ethical idealism safely locked up in their separate compartments finds that each of the prisoners is increasingly restive. Religious thought is no longer content to dismiss the transactions of business as matters irrelevant to the life of the spirit. The line of division between the sphere of religion and secular business is shifting. By common consent, the Treaty of Partition has lapsed, and the boundaries are once more in motion. Rightly or wrongly, with wisdom or with its opposite, an attempt is being made to restate the practical implications of the social ethics of the Christian faith in a form sufficiently comprehensive to provide a standard by which to judge the collective actions and institutions of mankind in the sphere both of international politics and social and economic organization. And he finished, as in the analogous problem of relations between church and state, issues which were once thought to have been buried have been shown in our own day that they were not dead, but sleeping. Now, Tawney's observations could have been written yesterday, which is exactly what makes them both exhilarating and discouraging. Since he wrote in the 1920s, efforts to overcome the modern division between economics and morality have repeatedly grown dormant and then suddenly stirred from slumber. And the reception offered the latest such effort, the vigorous first draft of a pastoral letter on the economy by America's Catholic bishops, shows how deep-seated are the opposing tendencies whose origins Tawney studied 6 decades back. It is not really surprising that the bishop's letter should have proved controversial. The decision to write such a letter was made at the 1980 meeting of the bishops, which also voted to prepare a pastoral letter examining the question of nuclear war. One observer, looking back at this double-barreled decision, remarked that the bishops may be fiercely opposed to abortion and euthanasia, but they seem rather favorably inclined toward suicide. Once the nuclear pastoral, which had been given priority, turned out to directly challenge current armaments policy, and in view of a number of run-ins between national Catholic agencies and the administration over budget cutbacks affecting the poor, business circles grew uneasy about what might be ticking away in the bishops' work on the economy. The bishops, in fact, seem to be acting out the text of that classic telegram home that goes, "Start worrying, message to come." A few people did more than start worrying. A group of Catholics, headed by William Simon and Michael Novak, and heavily weighted with conservatives and neoconservatives linked with the Nixon and Reagan administrations, began preparing an alternate lay statement. This was an exercise, as one admirer described it, in preemptive damage control. The bishops did their best to be accommodating. The list of individuals with whom they held formal consultations is heavy with business executives. They met with representatives of the Simon Novak group, and indeed with Novak himself on several other occasions. Nonetheless, when the draft did appear on November 11th, it did not disappoint. The contrast between its economic philosophy and that of an administration which only 5 days earlier had won a massive vote of confidence was front-page news. Where the administration celebrated the successes of the American economy, the bishops contrasted these successes with persistent shortcomings. Where the administration exalted Native American individualism, the bishops emphasized what they called communal solidarity. Where the administration minimized and at times even derided the economic role of government, the bishops endorsed government efforts to guide the economy and provide social welfare. Where the administration prescribed inegalitarian tax measures and the acceptance of a goodly measure of unemployment as necessary if unpalatable steps to prosperity, the bishops judged the existing level of inequality in America as morally unacceptable, called for a new national commitment to full employment as the leading domestic priority, declared that the litmus test of any society's economy was the way it treated the poor and the powerless. Business Week magazine concluded that the letter's comments on the workings of the economy in 4 areas: unemployment, poverty, economic relations with developing nations, and economic planning, amount to a wide-ranging critique of Reagan's less is more brand of governance. Now, to those castaways who felt the rising flood of Reaganomics about to sweep everything before it, the bishop's letter was a very welcome bit of dry firmament. And even a few of the president's supporters could welcome the letter as what they called a useful corrective. David Gergen, former director of communications at the Reagan White House, wrote, "The bishops have spoken up at exactly the right time and in the right way. At a moment when the nation is about to make crucial decisions, economic decisions, the bishops have said we must focus again on the rising tide of poverty in America." Most conservatives were not so generous. The Reverend Jerry Falwell saw the letter as pointing the way to communism. So in effect did Norman Podhoretz. A columnist on the conservative National Review called the draft economically illiterate and an appeal to envy, while comparing the bishops to Lenin and declaring them spiritually impoverished. The editors of that journal labeled the letter ecclesiastical mondialism. The bishops were off-the-wall utopians, engaged in the evisceration of their own moral and intellectual authority. William F. Buckley, Jr. was, by comparison, restrained, merely dismissing the bishop's draft as an accumulation of lumpen cliches and a puree of vapidity. Mr. George Will actually outdid Buckley in disdain. The bishops, he began, had discovered that God subscribes to the liberal agenda. And dripping sarcasm, he continued, but then, in the mental world to which the bishops, in their flight from complexity, have immigrated, there are no intellectual difficulties, no insoluble problems. There are only shortages of goodwill. The bishops, he said, convict themselves of, at best, childlike innocence or vanity. They simply postulate a duty to cleanse this sad old world of blemishes. Their letter springs from minds marinated in conventional wisdom. They never entertain a doubt about government programs. The same tone, interestingly enough, marked the criticism by the neoconservative Charles Krauthammer, an editor at the nominally liberal journal, The New Republic. Given the economic failings of Catholicism in the past, the bishops, he said, might proceed with a touch of humility. That quality is difficult to find in the letter. Instead, Krauthammer finds a tone of magisterial righteousness and a routine acceptance of liberal assumptions. Worse, the bishops suffer from what he says is a profound naivete, a belief in the power of good intentions, and an accompanying obliviousness to the intractability of certain problems. Michael Novak himself called the draft whiny and ungenerous, and Andrew M. Greeley, sociologist and popular novelist, having fully distanced himself from what he called the nervous neighings of Novak, concluded that the letter was inept and inadequate. The complaints of these critics, echoed in dozens of local editorial columns, can be summed up in a handful of propositions. The bishops are platitudinous. Who is against the poor anyhow? The bishops are uninformed. All these questions, after all, are terribly complex. The bishops are partisan. As spiritual leaders, they should stick to announcing broad norms rather than acting like the liberal wing of the Democratic Party at prayer. The bishops are unrealistic. They slight the strengths of the U.S. economy and would put demands on it that cumulatively might be crippling. The bishops are behind the times. Their proposals date from Great Society programs or derive from the mixed economies of Western Europe, and even when successful, both these economic models have now reached the limits of their possibilities. Amidst all these criticisms, there are, I would hasten to grant, a number of very valid points, as well as, obviously enough, a number of contradictory ones. But what a surprise, I must say, to turn from these strictures to the text of the draft itself. One wonders, in fact, how many of the critics did so. The bishop's text is bracketed by reflections on precisely the problem that Tawney addressed. We are well aware, they write, of the difficulties involved in relating moral and religious values to economic life. Modern society has become so complex and fragmented that people have difficulty sensing the relationship among the different dimensions of their lives, such as the economic, the moral, and the religious. And at the very close of the letter, none of us can afford to live a spiritually schizophrenic existence in which our private lives are oriented toward Christian discipleship while our economic activities are devoid of these same values. But the bishops do not assume naively that they can return to a pre-modern worldview dominated by religious faith alone. Citing a text from the Second Vatican Council, they readily agree that social and economic affairs enjoy their own laws and values which must be gradually deciphered, put to use, and regulated by human beings. They have turned to experts in preparing this letter, precisely out of their conviction, as they write, that earthly affairs have a rightful independence which the Church and we as bishops must respect. The bishops' awareness of the difficulties of their task is reflected in the very structure of their letter, which its critics generally ignore. The letter is divided into two parts. The first is titled Biblical and Theological Foundations. It, in turn, is subdivided into two sections. First comes a rich reflection on biblical themes of creation, covenant, and community, on the primacy of justice and solidarity with the poor in the biblical vision. This is followed by an elaboration of, as it's titled, Ethical Norms for Economic Life, which do not rely explicitly on the language or authority of scriptures, a response to the realities of secularization and pluralism that Tawney had explored in their origins. The bishops know that their words must be understandable and persuasive, at least in part, to those outside their religious tradition as well as to those within it. The first subsection speaks in a distinctly Christian voice. The second tries to address all citizens in a rationally defensible manner, as accessible to the non-believer as to the believer. Now, there are three things to be noted about this first part of the letter. One of them was emphasized in the press coverage, the bishop's outspoken insistence on the needs of the poor. Not so widely understood was how this insistence was part of an intensely social and communitarian vision. The bishop's starting point for evaluation of the economy is human dignity, and human dignity as realized in community with others. The bishop's focus was not on material deprivation per se, but on whatever, material deprivation included, of course, whatever kept free people from being active participants in their human communities. Respect for human dignity in this participatory, communitarian sense requires three things: a minimum level of material security, an opportunity for self-realization and community contribution through work, and institutions that enhance social solidarity. This emphasis on social solidarity led the bishops not only to endorse affirmative action and comparable worth as concepts relevant to correcting the effects of racial and sexual discrimination, it led them to two other controversial judgments. One was the conclusion that while they saw numerous justifications for inequalities of reward, the degree of gross inequality in income and wealth in the United States, quite independent of the absolute amount of well-being it might afford those at lower levels, was itself morally unacceptable. Further, the bishops called for an experiment in economic democracy, consisting of an acceptance of economic rights, to minimum economic provision, to a worthwhile job, and to an active role in directing one's work. An experiment in economic democracy parallel to the Founding Fathers' innovations in political democracy. Now, while this letter is definite and perhaps even radical in setting forth the standards by which an economy like the United States' should be evaluated, it is simultaneously modest and even reticent, far too reticent, some would say, in plumping for any particular diagnosis of the economy's problems and prospects. There is no clear consensus, the bishops acknowledge at the outset, about the nature of the problems facing the country or about the best ways to address these problems effectively. Again and again, the bishops note the complexity of these issues. They don't pretend the church has all the answers, but do think it can, quote, make an important contribution to finding the right path. Again and again, the bishops acknowledge that people of goodwill, Catholics among them, will disagree about particular economic policies. The bishops, quote, expect and welcome debate. Quote, there is certainly room for pluralism within the church on these matters. Quote, there will undoubtedly be disputes about the concrete implications of these priorities in our complex world. We do not seek to foreclose discussion. By and large, it was not this first part of the bishop's draft on ethical norms that attracted most attention, but the second part on specific policy applications. In this respect, pastoral letters are unlike loans. It is never the principal that earns the interest. But the distinction between the two parts of the letter is essential for understanding the bishop's work. In an introduction to the second part, they are utterly clear about the differences between their policy applications and the first part that went before. And I will have to quote at length, because I think this section was more than other critically was either ignored or misunderstood, and that fact explains much of the criticism that the letter has received. In that introduction to the second part, the bishops write, the movement from principle to practice is a complex and sometimes difficult task. Ethical values in themselves do not dictate specific kinds of programs or provide the blueprints for action. Rather, our principles must interact with empirical data, with historical, social, and political realities, and with competing demands for limited resources. The effectiveness of our prudential judgments in this area will depend not only on the moral force of our principles, but also on the empirical accuracy of our information and our assumptions. We recognize that in certain cases, the same principles may be interpreted differently, or combined with other assumptions may lead to different conclusions. And the bishops then repeat something that they said in their pastoral letter on nuclear weaponry. We do not intend that our treatment of each of these specific issues carry the same moral authority as our statement of universal moral principles and formal church teaching. When making applications of these principles, we realize, and we wish our readers to recognize, that prudential judgments are involved based on specific circumstances which can change or which can be interpreted differently by people of goodwill. And so the bishops conclude, we expect that on complex economic questions, a diversity of opinions on specific policy applications will exist, even among those who hold the same moral principles. We urge mutual respect among different groups as they carry on this dialogue. For this process of reflection and dialogue will be most constructive if it is characterized not only by conviction and commitment, but also by civility and charity. This, presumably, is the arrogance and the tone of magisterial righteousness that Mr. Krauthammer, no stranger to either, finds so insufferable in the letter. This, no doubt, is the basis for the peroration of the article in Commentary magazine by Peter Berger, who, after writing a rather fine-grained critique of what is, by his own account, no radical document, suddenly puffs himself up to declaim, by what right, then, do these men appear before us, wrapped in the mantle of authority of prophets and popes, stretching back to ancient Israel, and dare to tell us that one set of highly precarious policy choices represents the will of God in our time? It is, I will admit, a bit tedious to cite chapter and verse of the bishop's letter to refute the fatuousness of Krauthammer or the bluster of Berger. And it might be more tedious yet to note all the further acknowledgments of complexity and uncertainty to be found throughout that second part of the draft. In discussing the difficulties of achieving a national commitment to full employment, for example, the draft explicitly states that the problem derives not only from our shortage of goodwill and sensitivity to the sufferings of the unemployed, but also is, quote, a consequence of conflicting interpretations of what causes unemployment. The bishops go on, no single all-purpose cure is available. Government jobs programs have been marked by, they say, both successes and failures from which we can learn. Here evidently is what Mr. Will considers a flight from complexity, or the refusal to admit intellectual difficulties, or even to entertain a doubt about government programs. I do not pretend that there are no real problems with the bishop's letter, or that nothing stands between them and their critics more substantial than the fog of condescension and polemic. Nonetheless, the disparity between the bishop's text and its critics' reports are dramatic enough to cry out for some explanation. Has functional illiteracy really made such inroads among my fellow journalists and editorial writers? Why do the bishop's critics so regularly up the ante in order to make their work of demolition that much easier? If the bishops condemn an aspect of the American economy as morally unacceptable, then supposedly they have cursed it root and branch. If the bishops decry inequality, then supposedly they are calling, as Mr. Novak wrote, for the federal government to have new and sweeping powers to set limits on everyone's income and wealth. Perhaps what we are seeing here is simply the territorial imperative. Neither Mr. Buckley, nor Mr. Will, nor Mr. Krauthammer, nor Mr. Berger, nor Mr. Novak, nor myself for that matter, are known for any contribution to the technical discipline of economics. They, or we, should be seen not so much as economics, but in our own spheres as perhaps a species of aspiring bishops. One group of preachers contending for turf against a rival group. Less speculative, I believe, is the role that a deep-seated stereotype may have played, not only in the critics' characterization of the draft letter, but in their very reading of it, in the selective attention they gave to some parts and not to others. That is the stereotype of the clergyman as an unworldly, moralistic, and at least pretentious, if not hypocritical, do-gooder. Like other stereotypes, this one is based on some bit of reality. But readers of the letter ought to at least consider another possibility. Consider the possibility that the committee which drafted this letter was constituted of fairly intelligent individuals, most of whom must even meet a large payroll and supervise a sizable network of activities and organizations. Assume that they actually listened to the approximately 125 individuals who appeared before them over several years of hearings: business executives, union officials, economists, government policymakers, ethicists, scripture scholars, welfare recipients, minority leaders, representatives of other religious traditions. And assume that these hearings, if nothing else, expose them to multiple viewpoints and to almost endless complexities. Note that they had among their staff several members with considerable experience in Washington, plus a Harvard sociologist of moderately liberal views and a post-Keynesian economist with social democratic leanings, both of them academically credentialed and well aware of the range of professional opinions and technical arguments. It may be consoling to suppose that if the final product reached conclusions one doesn't favor, this was due only to routine acceptance of liberal assumptions, or childlike innocence, or mere conventional wisdom. But it is also, in its own fashion, a bit arrogant. It excludes the likelihood that the bishops and their assistants knew very well what they were doing, and whether with ultimate wisdom or not, adopted a number of liberal positions on the basis of informed and considered judgments. If one discards this highly convenient stereotype of the bishops, the lines of criticism advanced against their letter by no means dissolve entirely, but they do appear in a new perspective. And this is especially so when the bishop's draft is compared with the rival document from the Simon Novak Committee. It is true, for example, that there are lacunae in the bishop's considerations and references. Everyone can pick out a favorite argument, book, or bit of data and ask, why didn't the bishops think of that? In many a case, perhaps they or their staff did and deliberately set it aside. Still, there are undoubtedly alternative positions, facts, interpretations that they did not sufficiently explore, as many on their left, it might be noted, as on their right. But the same turns out to be true with a vengeance of the Simon Novak letter. Indeed, its references to economic literature are far more ideologically bunched together, if you will, than those of the bishops, which did not inspire any of the bishops' critics to term the Simon Novak effort economically illiterate. The point, however, is not to argue the superiority of the bishop's letter to the Simon Novak one, although I think that could be done, but to note that in our day, as soon as moral teachers try at all to touch base with the real world, they cannot avoid some alignment in the complex battles of social science, even as they, one hopes, strive to withhold canonization from Lord Keynes or Milton Friedman or Karl Marx. The bishops are determined to avoid leaving their teachings at that high level of generality that invites every which interpretation, and hence the charge of being platitudinous. They want to avoid the resort of the 18th century divines that Tawney wrote about, who, confronted with the vigor of a new independent science of economics, began, said Tawney, to formulate ethical principles of Christianity in terms of a comfortable ambiguity, and rarely indicate with any precision their application to commerce, finance, and the ownership of property. But when the bishops extend themselves to specific applications, they recognize the danger, unavoidable in some measure, of casting in their lot with some particular school of economic thought, a danger especially threatening at a time when the disarray of contending schools in economics is as great as it is today. Their strategy, therefore, is to cast this part of the letter in the form of a pedagogical exercise and a moral stimulus. The topics they address, they say, are illustrative economic issues in our day. This document, they insist, is not a technical blueprint for economic reform, but rather an attempt to foster a serious moral analysis of economic justice. In sum, this second part of their letter is their best attempt to show how the general norms drawn from Scripture and the social demands of human dignity apply to specific issues. Others are welcome to reach different conclusions, provided they make the moral connections in as serious and scrupulous a manner. Now, what this defense of the bishop's procedure assumes, of course, is that the general approach taken in their policy recommendations is at least a highly plausible one, and this many of their critics obviously deny. Once again, it is interesting to turn to the Simon Novak alternative. That document argues the case for an entrepreneurial capitalism relatively free of government regulation or efforts to redistribute income. In its support, it includes a table of comparative economic measures, listing over 160 of the world's nations and categorizing them as either capitalist, socialist, mixed capitalist, capitalist statist, or mixed socialist. Each nation is rated according to its degree of political and economic freedom, plus its per capita gross national product as of 1978, and a measure of what is called a physical quality of life index. Now, if one returns from this table to the source from which the committee derived it, one finds the following description of the mixed capitalist category. Mixed capitalist systems were defined as those that provide social services on a large scale through governmental or other nonprofit institutions, with the result that private control over property is sacrificed to egalitarian purposes. These nations still see capitalism as legitimate, but its legitimacy is accepted grudgingly by many in government. Now, I don't think that in a rough way, it would be unfair to say that the bishop's letter points more or less in the direction of such mixed capitalist regimes, while the Simon Novak letter points in the direction of distinctly capitalist ones in which egalitarianism is given a lower priority, in which social services are more strictly rationed, and in which the legitimacy of capitalism is greatly honored. That is why it is noteworthy that the very table reproduced in the Simon Novak letter shows the mixed capitalist economies equaling the capitalist ones in freedom and excelling them in physical quality of life and in per capita gross national product. This comparison leads me to another point about the real differences between the bishops and their critics. These differences finally have less to do with the answers or facts provided than with what questions are asked. In publishing that table, for example, the Simon Novak group undoubtedly thought they were strengthening their case, not because of any comparison between capitalist and mixed capitalist economies, which they probably never even noticed, but because of the favorable contrast between capitalist and socialist economies. In other words, they were asking a question about the legitimacy of capitalism, a question they posed largely, even though not very explicitly, against the ideological background of the East-West conflict. The bishops are hardly unaware of the East-West conflict, but in this letter they are asking another question. Given the tremendous achievements to date of our economy and its exceptional potential and influence in the world, what do we want to make of it? Or are we going to let it, like a natural force, not of our own control, make something of us? And so, step by step, I am forced back from the second part of the bishop's draft, which has stirred almost all of the controversy, to the first part. By and large, the bishop's critics avoid confronting them on this section of their letter. Everyone agrees on these principles they suggest. It is only how we put them into operation that is at issue. But does everyone really agree? Do we really agree that an economy is to be evaluated not simply by the aggregate or average wealth it produces, but by the way that wealth is distributed so that none experience exclusion? Or by the way the work that produces that wealth is organized so that the everyday activity of all can be imbued with meaning? Or by the way institutions foster participation and solidarity rather than passivity and isolation? For all the genius and subtlety of the mind of Adam Smith, who is often as rashly caricatured by modern liberals as the bishops have been by their critics, it seems obvious to me that he did not accept the criteria the bishops set forth. Adam Smith was concerned about the well-being of the poor as well as of the average person. But that well-being he defined largely in terms of material subsistence and consumption, and he saw it as precisely the product of the transformation whose description by Tawney began my observations. That is, that division of life into its elements, politics, business, and spiritual exercises. Each assumes a separate and independent vitality and obeys the laws of its own being, separate and parallel compartments between which a due balance should be maintained, but which have no vital connection with one another. It is noteworthy that what Tawney saw as a key problem of the modern world, this division, the Simon Novak Committee simply proposes as its solution. It presents this division of the social system into a separate political system, economic system, and moral cultural system as a uniquely American innovation, in effect linking capitalism to our pride in America's political freedom and institutions. These three different systems are to serve as checks and balances, supports, and correctives for one another. And this is surely an improvement over the monolithic social system of a theocratic or totalitarian society. But unfortunately, the Simon Novak schema provides little guidance for determining when, short of theocracy or totalitarianism, the separate and parallel compartments, to use Tawney's words, are no longer in due balance. And this is particularly so since the Simon Novak letter did not risk, as the bishops did, going into details. The bishops, on the other hand, have tried to propose what Tawney would call a vital connection between these separate compartments. First, by their uncompromising moral stand on human solidarity and the rights of the vulnerable and the excluded, and second, by their somewhat more tentative proposal for economic democracy. That the bishop's letter has proven controversial is said to stem not from its premises, which are unexceptionable, but from its concrete suggestions, which are impractical and radical. I would argue, on the contrary, that the bishop's specific applications, though debatable, are relatively modest and open-ended. In the end, it is their very premises that sharply challenge the deeply rooted assumptions of our modern age. Thank you.